Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and discovering that one invisible ingredient has been quietly shaping your cravings, your energy, your mood, even the way your brain makes decisions every single day. Not alcohol, not nicotine, not some rare chemical hidden in a laboratory, sugar. And the strangest part is this: your brain may still be responding to sugar as if you were living thousands of years ago, wandering through forests, desperate to survive, searching for the rare sweetness of ripe fruit before winter arrived. But you are not living in that world anymore. Today, sweetness is everywhere: in soda, in cereal, in bread, in yogurt, in sauces, in snacks designed by billion-dollar laboratories to make you want one more bite and then another and then another. So here's the question that scientists have been asking for years. Why does the human brain react so powerfully to sugar? Why do so many people feel trapped in cycles of cravings, fatigue, emotional eating, and constant hunger, even when they know sugar may be harming them? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what happens when an ancient survival system collides with a modern food industry that has learned how to exploit it? Stay with me, because by the end of this journey, you may never look at sweetness the same way again. And if you enjoy deep scientific health documentaries like this, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because the modern world is filled with hidden biological traps, and understanding them may be one of the most important survival skills of our time. There is something almost magical about sweetness. A newborn baby who has never seen the world before, who does not understand language, culture, money, or technology, will still instinctively respond positively to sweet taste. Scientists have observed this again and again. Even infants naturally prefer sweetness. That reaction is ancient, far older than civilization itself. To understand why sugar has such extraordinary power over the human mind, we need to travel back into deep human history, long before supermarkets, before candy, before processed food, before refrigerators, before agriculture itself. For most of human evolution, food was uncertain. Calories were precious. Sweetness was rare. And in nature, sweetness usually meant something important: energy. A ripe fruit full of natural sugars could provide fast fuel for survival. Honey could deliver massive calories in a world where starvation was always nearby. Sweet foods were generally safe compared to bitter plants, many of which could be poisonous. So the human brain evolved a very simple but powerful rule: sweet equals valuable. And when something is valuable for survival, evolution rewards the behavior. This is where the story becomes far more complicated, because the brain does not merely recognize sweetness, it rewards it. Deep inside the brain is a network often called the reward system. When you experience something beneficial for survival, food, social bonding, achievement, the brain releases chemical messengers that reinforce the behavior. One of the most famous is dopamine. Now, dopamine is often misunderstood. It is not simply the pleasure chemical. It is more closely tied to motivation, anticipation, learning, and desire. Dopamine teaches the brain, this matters. Remember this. Do it again. And sugar is extremely effective at activating this system. In fact, brain imaging studies have shown that highly sweet foods can stimulate reward pathways in ways that resemble other compulsive behaviors. Not identical, not the same as narcotics, but similar enough that neuroscientists became deeply interested in the comparison. Because something unusual began happening in the modern world. People were no longer eating occasional natural sweetness. They were consuming concentrated refined sugar in amounts the human brain had never encountered before in evolutionary history. And the brain was not prepared for it. Think about a wild strawberry growing naturally in a forest. Small, fibrous, mildly sweet. Now compare that to a modern milkshake, soda, candy bar, or ultra-processed dessert engineered with enormous amounts of refined sugar combined with fat, texture, flavor chemistry, and artificial stimulation. One exists in nature. The other is a biological superstimulus, and the brain reacts accordingly. This is one reason why many people feel they lose control around certain foods, not because they are weak, not because they lack discipline, but because ancient survival circuits are being overwhelmed by modern engineering. Food scientists understand this extremely well. Entire industries spend billions studying what is sometimes called the bliss point, the precise combination of sugar, fat, salt, texture, and flavor that maximizes craving and repeat consumption, not satisfaction. Consumption. That distinction matters because satisfaction ends the eating experience. Craving extends it. And the modern food environment is often designed to keep the loop going. One bite becomes two, two becomes 10. A small craving becomes a nightly ritual. Over time, the brain begins adapting to constant overstimulation. This is where another important question appears. Why do people often crave more sugar after eating sugar? The answer involves several overlapping systems inside the brain and body. The first is dopamine adaptation. When reward pathways are stimulated repeatedly, the brain may become less sensitive over time. In simple terms, the same amount of sweetness may no longer feel as rewarding as it once did. So the brain seeks more stimulation, sweeter foods, larger amounts, more frequent exposure. A similar pattern can happen with many reward-driven behaviors in human life. But dopamine is only part of the story. Blood sugar fluctuations also play a major role. When someone consumes large amounts of refined sugar, especially liquid sugar like soda, glucose can enter the bloodstream extremely quickly. The body responds by releasing insulin to move glucose into cells. Sometimes this process happens so rapidly that blood sugar later drops sharply. And when blood sugar drops, the brain interprets the situation as an energy problem. That can trigger hunger, fatigue, irritability, difficulty concentrating, and powerful cravings for quick energy again, often in the form of more sugar. This creates a cycle many people know intimately. Craving, consumption, temporary relief, crash, craving again. And here is where the story becomes even more unsettling. Because sugar does not only influence hunger, it can influence emotion. Many people notice they crave sweet foods during stress, anxiety, loneliness, exhaustion, or emotional pain. This is not imaginary. Stress hormones interact directly with reward systems in the brain. When stress rises, the brain begins seeking comfort and rapid energy, and sugar delivers both temporarily. For a brief moment, dopamine increases, pleasure pathways activate, emotional discomfort softens, but the relief is often short-lived. And over time, emotional eating patterns can become deeply wired into daily life. The brain starts associating sweetness not merely with calories, but with emotional escape. This is one reason habits around sugar can feel surprisingly difficult to change, because people are not only responding to taste, they are responding to memory, emotion, stress, reward, biology, and conditioning layered together over years. Now, remember the three questions we opened with. Why does sugar hold such power over the brain? Why do cravings seem to grow stronger over time? And what happens when ancient survival instincts collide with the modern food environment? We are beginning to see the answers emerge, but another mystery is still waiting ahead. Because the brain's relationship with sugar does not stop at craving. Researchers are now exploring something far more concerning. What if excessive sugar consumption can actually influence attention, memory, mood, and mental clarity itself? Some scientists believe the modern epidemic of exhaustion and brain fog may be connected, at least partly, to the metabolic chaos created by ultra-processed diets. And the evidence keeps growing. But before we reach that point, we need to understand something even more fundamental. What actually happens inside the human body during the first few minutes after sugar enters your mouth? Because the journey from tongue to bloodstream to brain happens far faster than most people realize. And what begins as sweetness on the tongue can quickly become a biological roller coaster, affecting nearly every organ system in the body, especially when the sugar arrives in liquid form. A single cold soda, sweet coffee, energy drink, or dessert beverage can trigger a chain reaction inside the body in less than an hour. And once you understand that process, you may finally understand why so many people feel energized, then exhausted, full, then hungry, comforted, then anxious, all within the same afternoon. A single can of soda can send your body through a biological roller coaster in less than 1 hour. Not metaphorically, literally. Within minutes, chemicals begin shifting inside your bloodstream. Hormones surge, brain signals change, energy systems react, and deep inside the body, organs begin responding to a flood of fast sugar that human biology was never designed to encounter in such concentrated form. At first, it may feel wonderful, a burst of energy, a sharper mood, a sense of comfort, mental stimulation, even emotional relief. But then something strange often happens. The energy fades, focus becomes unstable, hunger suddenly returns, irritation appears for no obvious reason. Some people become sleepy, others become anxious, others crave even more sugar almost immediately. And most people never realize that this entire chain reaction may have started with a few sweet mouthfuls only minutes earlier. So, what exactly is happening inside the human body during this process? Why does sugar create such dramatic swings in energy and mood? And why do so many people feel trapped inside cycles of craving, fatigue, and emotional instability without understanding the biology driving it? To answer those questions, we need to follow sugar on its journey through the body, because the moment sweetness touches your tongue, your biology begins changing. The process starts in the mouth. The tongue contains specialized taste receptors designed to detect sweetness with astonishing speed. The instant those receptors activate, signals race toward the brain. And here is something fascinating. The body often begins preparing for sugar before the sugar even reaches the bloodstream. The brain anticipates incoming calories, digestive systems activate, hormonal responses begin shifting in expectation. In other words, your body is not passively receiving food, it is predicting it. Then the sugar moves downward into the stomach and small intestine. This is where absorption accelerates. Refined sugar, especially in liquid form, requires very little digestion. There is almost no fiber slowing it down, no significant barrier, no natural structure forcing gradual release. So glucose begins flooding rapidly through the intestinal wall into the bloodstream, and suddenly the body detects something important. Blood sugar levels are rising. Now imagine the bloodstream as a tightly controlled highway system. The human body works extremely hard to keep blood glucose within a relatively stable range. Too low can threaten survival. Too high can damage tissues. So the moment glucose rises sharply, the pancreas reacts. It releases insulin. Insulin is one of the most powerful metabolic hormones in the human body. Its job is often simplified as lowering blood sugar, but its real role is much broader. Insulin acts like a biological traffic controller. It signals cells to absorb glucose from the bloodstream and either use it immediately for energy or store it for later. Muscle cells absorb glucose, liver cells absorb glucose, fat cells absorb glucose. And this is where modern sugary foods begin creating unusual stress on the system. Because sweet beverages can deliver enormous amounts of sugar extremely fast. A soda may contain more sugar than ancient humans could encounter naturally in an entire day. And unlike solid food, liquids move rapidly. There is little slowing the process. So blood glucose spikes sharply, and insulin rises sharply in response. Now, initially, many people experience this phase as pleasant. The brain suddenly receives abundant fuel. Glucose is one of the brain's preferred energy sources. Under normal conditions, the brain consumes enormous amounts of it continuously. So when glucose becomes rapidly available, people may temporarily feel more alert, more awake, more motivated, more mentally stimulated. This is one reason sugary drinks became so psychologically powerful in modern culture. They create the illusion of energy. But the illusion often comes with a hidden cost, because rapid spikes are rarely stable. The body dislikes extremes. And when blood sugar rises aggressively, insulin sometimes responds aggressively as well. Glucose begins leaving the bloodstream quickly, sometimes too quickly. This is where the crash begins. Many people describe it differently. Some say they feel drained, others feel shaky, others feel mentally foggy, some become irritable or emotionally sensitive. Some suddenly crave another snack, despite eating recently. This phenomenon is often called a sugar crash. But what is really happening? Part of the answer lies in instability. The brain depends heavily on stable energy supply. When blood sugar fluctuates rapidly, the brain notices, and the brain does not enjoy unpredictability. Even relatively modest drops in blood glucose can trigger stress responses inside the body. Adrenal hormones may increase, hunger signals intensify, attention becomes harder to maintain, the body begins trying to restore stability quickly. And what is the fastest solution the brain remembers? More sugar. This is one reason sugary foods can create repeating behavioral loops throughout the day. Morning pastry, energy boost, crash. Sweet coffee, temporary focus, crash again. Afternoon soda, short stimulation, evening exhaustion. Over time, many people start believing something false. They think sugar gives them energy, but often sugar is merely interrupting the fatigue cycle it helped create. This distinction is incredibly important because stable energy and stimulated energy are not the same thing. Stable energy rises gradually and remains relatively consistent. Stimulated energy spikes rapidly, then collapses. And modern processed foods are extremely effective at creating spikes. Now, here's where another major question emerges. Why do these fluctuations affect mood so strongly? Why can blood sugar shifts influence emotions, patience, motivation, and even anxiety? The answer involves the extraordinary sensitivity of the brain. The human brain is an energy-demanding organ. Although it represents only a small percentage of body weight, it consumes enormous metabolic resources continuously. Neurons require carefully regulated fuel supply. Communication between brain cells depends on stable conditions. When glucose levels swing unpredictably, brain function can become less stable too. Researchers have linked rapid blood sugar fluctuations with mood instability, irritability, reduced concentration, and emotional volatility in some individuals. Many people recognize this intuitively without realizing the biology underneath it. They become hangry, hungry and angry at the same time. But this reaction is not merely psychological weakness. It reflects the brain detecting a potential energy problem, and the body responds defensively. Now remember one of the hidden questions we opened earlier. Why does sugar seem to create cravings instead of satisfaction? We are getting closer to the answer, because the body is not simply responding to sweetness itself. It is responding to cycles: rapid rise, rapid fall, rapid compensation, and the modern food environment is filled with products engineered to maximize those cycles, especially beverages. Liquid sugar may be one of the most disruptive forms of sugar consumption in modern life. When people eat whole fruits, fiber slows absorption. Chewing slows intake. Fullness signals have time to activate. But sugary drinks bypass many of those protective mechanisms. A sweet beverage can deliver enormous glucose load before the brain fully registers satiety. And because liquids often feel less filling than solid foods, people may consume large amounts without realizing how much sugar entered the body. This creates a dangerous mismatch between calorie intake and fullness perception. The body receives massive energy, but appetite may remain partially unsatisfied. This is one reason sugary beverages are strongly associated with weight gain and metabolic dysfunction in many scientific studies. But the story becomes even more concerning when this pattern repeats daily for years. Because insulin is not designed to remain constantly elevated forever, cells can gradually become less responsive. The body begins needing more insulin to achieve the same effect. And that process may open the door to one of the most important metabolic problems in the modern world: insulin resistance. At first, the signs can feel subtle: fatigue after meals, persistent hunger, difficulty losing weight, brain fog, energy crashes, increased cravings. Many people assume these feelings are normal consequences of modern life: stress, aging, lack of sleep, being busy. But underneath the surface, metabolism itself may already be struggling. And the frightening part is that this process can develop silently for years before obvious disease appears. Now think carefully about the pattern we have uncovered so far. The brain craves sweetness because ancient survival systems reward it. Modern foods deliver sugar in unnaturally concentrated forms. Blood sugar spikes rapidly, insulin surges, energy rises temporarily, then instability follows. Cravings return, and the cycle repeats again and again. But another mystery still remains unanswered. If sugar creates so much energy, why do so many high-sugar diets eventually leave people chronically exhausted? Why do some individuals feel tired almost all the time despite consuming massive amounts of calories? And what happens when the body becomes so overwhelmed by constant sugar exposure that its energy systems begin malfunctioning altogether? Because in the next stage of this story, we are going deeper into one of the strangest paradoxes in modern health: how a body surrounded by abundant calories can slowly begin acting as though it is starving for energy. Some scientists now believe sugar does not merely affect your waistline. It may influence the way your brain functions itself: your attention, your motivation, your emotional stability, your memory, even the feeling of whether life seems exciting or strangely dull. And if that sounds exaggerated, consider something unsettling. Why do so many people reach for sugar not when they are starving, but when they are stressed? Why does emotional exhaustion so often lead to cravings for ice cream, chocolate, soda, pastries, or ultra-processed comfort foods? And why do some people feel mentally foggy, emotionally flat, or unable to focus after years of high sugar consumption? These questions are pulling scientists deeper into one of the most fascinating and controversial areas of modern neuroscience. Because the relationship between sugar and the brain may be far more powerful than most people realize. To understand this, we need to return to dopamine. But this time, we need to look at dopamine differently. Most people think dopamine creates pleasure. In reality, dopamine is deeply connected to pursuit, wanting, seeking, anticipation, motivation. It pushes organisms toward behaviors that the brain considers important for survival: food, safety, social connection, achievement. And for ancient humans, this system was brilliant. If sweet foods were rare and valuable, the brain needed a mechanism powerful enough to encourage humans to search for them aggressively. So when sweetness appeared, dopamine activity increased. The brain learned, this matters. Remember this. Find it again. The problem is that modern sugar does not resemble the sweetness human beings evolved with. Natural sweetness in the ancient world came packaged with limitations: fiber, seasonal availability, physical effort, scarcity. Modern processed sugar removes those limitations almost completely. Now sweetness can be delivered instantly, in concentrated doses, combined with fat, texture, artificial flavor chemistry, and rapid absorption. The result is something the brain experiences almost like a reward explosion. And the brain remembers it. This is why certain foods can occupy mental space so intensely. People may stop thinking about lunch, then suddenly see a dessert advertisement, smell baked sugar, or experience stress, and the craving circuitry activates immediately. Not because the body desperately needs calories, but because the brain has learned powerful emotional associations. This learning process is incredibly important because dopamine does not only reinforce pleasure, it reinforces habits. Over time, the brain begins building automatic pathways. Movie equals candy. Stress equals chocolate. Fatigue equals sweet coffee. Celebration equals cake. Sadness equals ice cream. Eventually, the behavior becomes less conscious. People often believe they are making spontaneous choices, but many cravings are actually learned neurological loops running automatically beneath awareness. And the modern environment is constantly strengthening those loops. Bright packaging, food advertisements, social media, convenience stores, delivery apps, endless exposure to ultra-sweet foods. Your brain is being surrounded by reward triggers almost every waking hour. But something even more fascinating happens under stress, because stress dramatically changes how the brain responds to sugar. Imagine an ancient human under threat: food scarcity, danger, harsh environments. In survival situations, the brain shifts priorities rapidly. Immediate energy becomes extremely valuable. This is where stress hormones like cortisol begin interacting with reward systems. When stress rises, the brain often seeks fast comfort and fast fuel, and sugar delivers both temporarily. Sweet foods can reduce activity in certain stress pathways for short periods. Dopamine rises, pleasure circuits activate, emotional discomfort softens. This is why stressed individuals often crave highly palatable foods even when they are not physically hungry. The brain is not asking only for calories, it is asking for relief. But here is the trap: the relief is temporary, and repeated emotional eating can slowly train the brain to depend on sugar during distress. Over time, stress itself becomes a trigger. The moment anxiety appears, the craving appears beside it. This connection may explain why so many people feel trapped in cycles of emotional eating despite understanding the health consequences intellectually. Logic is competing against deeply wired survival circuitry, and survival circuitry is powerful. Now remember one of the hidden questions from earlier. Can sugar actually influence mental clarity and cognitive performance? Researchers increasingly believe the answer may be yes. The brain depends heavily on stable metabolic function. When blood sugar fluctuates constantly, brain performance may fluctuate too. Many individuals consuming large amounts of refined sugar describe symptoms like difficulty concentrating, mental fatigue, forgetfulness, reduced focus, slow thinking, low motivation, often called brain fog. Brain fog is not a formal disease. It is a broad description people use when the mind feels cloudy, unfocused, or mentally exhausted. And while many factors can contribute to it, Researchers are exploring how unstable glucose regulation and chronic inflammation may play important roles. Because the brain is extremely sensitive to metabolic disruption, neurons require enormous energy stability. Communication between brain cells depends on delicate chemical balance. Even small disturbances can influence cognition. Some animal studies have shown that diets extremely high in refined sugar may impair certain forms of memory and learning over time. Particularly in areas involving the hippocampus, a brain structure deeply involved in memory formation. And here is something deeply unsettling. The hippocampus also helps regulate appetite and decision-making around food. So researchers have begun asking a disturbing possibility. Could excessive sugar consumption gradually weaken the very brain systems involved in controlling eating behavior itself? In other words, could the foods designed to maximize cravings slowly impair the brain's ability to resist them? Scientists are still debating the full answer, but the possibility alone is remarkable. Now add another layer: inflammation. High sugar diets are associated with increased inflammatory activity throughout the body, and the brain is not isolated from this process. Chronic low-grade inflammation may influence mood, cognition, and emotional regulation. Some researchers are now investigating links between highly processed diets and increased risk of depression, anxiety, and emotional instability. Not because sugar is the sole cause. Human emotion is far more complicated than that. But because metabolism and mental health appear far more connected than previous generations realized, the brain is not floating separately from the body. The brain is part of the body. And when metabolism becomes unstable, the mind may feel unstable too. Now think about modern life for a moment. Millions of people wake up exhausted, consume sugar and caffeine for stimulation, crash later, experience stress, crave comfort food, sleep poorly, repeat the cycle the next day. Over time, many begin noticing something difficult to explain. Life feels emotionally flatter, motivation weakens, natural pleasures feel less satisfying, energy becomes dependent on stimulation. Why? Part of the answer may involve dopamine adaptation. Remember, dopamine systems adjust to repeated overstimulation. When the brain is flooded constantly with intense reward signals, ordinary experiences may begin feeling less exciting by comparison. Simple pleasures lose impact. Silence feels boring. Natural foods seem bland. Patience becomes harder. The brain starts demanding stronger stimulation to produce the same emotional effect. And this pattern does not remain limited to food. Many neuroscientists believe modern humans are increasingly trapped inside hyperstimulation environments involving processed food, endless scrolling, constant novelty, and rapid dopamine cycling. The brain never fully rests, never fully resets, always seeking the next reward signal. And sugar is deeply embedded inside that system. But perhaps the strangest part of all is this: the brain originally evolved dopamine not to make humans miserable, but to help them survive. The system itself is not broken. It is being overwhelmed by an environment it was never designed for, an ancient biological brain, trapped inside a world of industrialized stimulation. Now, another critical question begins emerging from the shadows. If sugar can influence brain reward systems, mood, motivation, stress responses, attention, and cognition, what happens to the body's actual energy systems after years of constant overload? Why do so many people consuming enormous amounts of calories still feel chronically tired? And how can cells become surrounded by fuel, yet behave as though they are starving? Because the next stage of this story takes us deeper into one of the great paradoxes of modern metabolism: a crisis where the body is flooded with energy, but slowly loses the ability to use it properly. Many people believe they are tired because they are not sleeping enough, and sometimes that is true. But there is another possibility hiding beneath the surface of modern life. What if millions of people are walking around exhausted not because they lack energy, but because their bodies are losing the ability to use energy properly? It sounds impossible at first. How can a body surrounded by calories feel starved for fuel? How can someone consume sweet coffee in the morning, a sugary snack in the afternoon, dessert at night, and still feel constantly drained? Why do so many people wake up tired, crash after meals, struggle through the afternoon, and depend on caffeine and sugar simply to function? To understand this paradox, we need to go deeper into the hidden machinery of metabolism. Because the crisis is not always about how much energy enters the body. Sometimes the crisis is about what the body can no longer do with it. And at the center of this story is a hormone we touched earlier, insulin. At first, insulin is protective. When glucose rises in the bloodstream, insulin helps move that glucose into cells. Think of insulin as a key. Cells contain tiny molecular doors that allow glucose to enter. Insulin helps unlock them. Under healthy conditions, this system works beautifully. You eat. Glucose rises moderately. Insulin responds. Cells absorb fuel. Energy is produced, stable, efficient, balanced. But modern diets often push this system far beyond what it evolved to handle. Especially diets filled with refined carbohydrates and sugary drinks consumed repeatedly throughout the day. Breakfast cereal, sweet coffee, soda, snacks, desserts, energy drinks. The body is forced to release insulin again and again and again. Now imagine someone knocking on your front door every few minutes for years. Eventually, you might stop responding normally. Something similar may happen at the cellular level. Cells can gradually become less sensitive to insulin signals. This condition is called insulin resistance, and it may be one of the most important metabolic problems in the modern world. At first, the pancreas compensates. It produces even more insulin to force glucose into cells. For a while, blood sugar may still appear relatively controlled, but beneath the surface, the system is becoming strained. The body is working harder and harder simply to maintain basic stability. And this is where the paradox begins. Because insulin resistance creates a bizarre biological situation. There is plenty of energy in the bloodstream, yet cells begin struggling to access it efficiently. The body becomes flooded with fuel while simultaneously acting starved for fuel. This is why some scientists describe insulin resistance almost like an internal energy crisis. The body has calories, but the metabolic machinery is becoming dysfunctional, and the consequences can affect nearly every system in the body, especially energy levels. Many people imagine fatigue as simple lack of motivation, but biological fatigue is often far deeper. Inside every cell are tiny structures called mitochondria. These microscopic organelles are often described as the power plants of the cell because they convert nutrients into usable energy. Every heartbeat, every thought, every movement, every nerve signal, all of it depends heavily on mitochondrial energy production. And mitochondria are highly sensitive to metabolic stress. Researchers are increasingly studying how chronic overnutrition, excessive sugar exposure, inflammation, and insulin resistance may impair mitochondrial efficiency over time. When this happens, the body may begin producing energy less effectively. And suddenly, the symptoms start sounding very familiar. Persistent tiredness, mental exhaustion, low motivation, reduced stamina, difficulty concentrating, feeling drained after simple tasks. Many people blame themselves for these feelings. They think they are lazy, undisciplined, weak, but metabolism itself may already be struggling underneath the surface. Now think about how strange modern life has become. Human beings evolved in environments where food scarcity was common. Today, many people live surrounded by constant calories, yet feel exhausted almost all the time. This contradiction would have seemed impossible to ancient humans, and yet it is happening everywhere. Part of the reason lies in the difference between stimulation and real energy. Sugar can temporarily stimulate the nervous system, but stimulation is not the same as metabolic stability. A sugary drink may create a rapid burst of alertness, but if blood sugar crashes afterward, if insulin spikes repeatedly, if inflammation rises, if mitochondria become stressed, the long-term result may be worsening fatigue instead of lasting vitality. This is one reason many people become trapped in cycles of dependence. Morning exhaustion leads to sugar and caffeine. Temporary stimulation follows. Then the crash arrives. Then another craving, another stimulant, another crash. The person feels tired, so they consume more of the very substances helping drive the instability. And slowly, the body loses resilience. Now here is another important piece of the puzzle. Insulin does more than regulate glucose. It also influences fat storage. When insulin levels remain elevated chronically, the body becomes more likely to store energy rather than release it, particularly around the abdomen. This is one reason visceral fat, the deep fat surrounding organs, is strongly linked with insulin resistance and metabolic disease. And visceral fat is not passive tissue. It behaves almost like an active inflammatory organ. It releases chemical signals that may worsen inflammation and further disrupt metabolism. So the cycle deepens. More insulin resistance, more inflammation, more metabolic dysfunction, more fatigue, and this process often develops quietly over many years, long before diabetes appears, long before major disease is diagnosed. People simply begin feeling off. They wake up tired. They lose mental sharpness. They feel older than they should. Their motivation declines. Exercise feels harder. Recovery slows. Many assume this is normal aging, but metabolism may already be under enormous pressure. Now remember one of the hidden questions still running underneath this entire story. If sugar can reshape energy systems this deeply, what else might it be doing inside the body? Because the metabolic crisis does not remain isolated to fatigue. Blood vessels feel it. Hormones feel it. The liver feels it. The heart feels it. And perhaps most dangerously of all, chronic sugar overload may slowly damage the very systems responsible for keeping humans alive long term. But before we go there, we need to confront another uncomfortable truth. Many people still believe sugar is mostly dangerous because of weight gain. Yet some of the most serious effects may be happening invisibly inside the cardiovascular system long before obvious obesity appears. Inflammation inside blood vessels, rising triglycerides, silent metabolic damage, increasing strain on the heart, and one of the biggest contributors may not be solid food at all, but liquid sugar. The sweet drinks many people consume every single day without fear. Because the next stage of this journey takes us into one of the most underestimated dangers in modern nutrition. How sugar may be quietly reshaping the cardiovascular system itself. One drink, one spike, one metabolic shock at a time. For decades, many people believed the greatest dietary threat to the heart was salt. But modern research has forced scientists to look much more carefully at another ingredient hiding almost everywhere in the food supply: sugar. Not just because it contributes to weight gain, not just because it affects diabetes, but because excessive sugar consumption may quietly damage the cardiovascular system itself for years before symptoms ever appear. And that possibility changes everything. Because heart disease rarely begins with dramatic warning signs. The process often starts silently: tiny changes, small injuries, invisible inflammation, metabolic stress accumulating day after day inside blood vessels most people never think about. And by the time chest pain or stroke symptoms appear, the damage may already be advanced. So how can something as ordinary as sugar affect something as vital as the human heart? Why are sugary drinks now considered especially dangerous by many researchers? And what is happening inside the bloodstream long before a person ever hears the words high blood pressure, heart attack, or stroke? To answer that, we need to look at blood vessels themselves. Inside the body exists a vast network of arteries, veins, and microscopic vessels carrying oxygen and nutrients to every organ. These vessels are not passive pipes. They are living tissue, flexible, responsive, biologically active. The inner lining of blood vessels is called the endothelium, and the health of this thin cellular layer is incredibly important. A healthy endothelium helps regulate blood flow, controls inflammation, prevents abnormal clotting, maintains vascular flexibility, but chronic metabolic stress can damage it, and excessive sugar exposure appears to be one of the factors contributing to that stress. When blood glucose rises repeatedly and excessively, inflammatory processes inside blood vessels may increase. Tiny injuries can begin accumulating along vessel walls. Oxidative stress rises, inflammatory chemicals circulate, vascular function becomes less efficient. At first, the body compensates remarkably well, but over years, the system may gradually deteriorate. And here is something deeply important to understand. Inflammation inside blood vessels is not always painful. A person may feel completely normal while damage slowly progresses. This is one reason cardiovascular disease can remain hidden for so long. Now remember the metabolic chaos we discussed earlier: repeated sugar spikes, repeated insulin surges, insulin resistance developing over time. Those changes do not stay isolated inside metabolism. They influence the cardiovascular system directly. One major effect involves triglycerides. Triglycerides are a type of fat circulating in the bloodstream. The body can produce them from excess calories, especially excess sugar. When large amounts of refined carbohydrates and sugary beverages are consumed regularly, the liver may convert surplus sugar into fat. triglyceride levels rise, and elevated triglycerides are strongly associated with increased cardiovascular risk. But the danger goes even deeper because excess sugar does not merely create fat under the skin. It often promotes visceral fat, the deep abdominal fat surrounding internal organs. And visceral fat behaves very differently from ordinary body fat. It is metabolically active, inflammatory, hormonal. It releases chemical signals that may worsen insulin resistance, inflammation, and vascular stress throughout the body. In other words, visceral fat is not simply stored energy. It can function almost like a biological amplifier of disease processes. This is why someone may appear only moderately overweight externally, while significant metabolic dysfunction is already developing internally. Now another question emerges. How does sugar connect to high blood pressure? At first glance, the connection seems strange. Most people associate blood pressure mainly with sodium, but metabolism and vascular health are deeply interconnected. Chronically elevated insulin levels may influence how the kidneys regulate sodium and fluid balance. Inflammation can reduce blood vessel flexibility. Excess visceral fat increases vascular stress. Sympathetic nervous system activity may rise. Over time, these processes can contribute to increasing blood pressure. And once blood pressure rises persistently, the heart must work harder continuously. Imagine forcing a pump to push against increasing resistance every minute of every day. Eventually, strain accumulates. The cardiovascular system begins aging faster. Now here is where sugary beverages become especially important. Liquid sugar may be one of the most underestimated threats in the modern diet because liquids behave differently from solid food. A sweet drink can deliver enormous glucose load rapidly without creating strong fullness signals. People may consume hundreds of calories in minutes and still remain hungry, but the body still experiences the metabolic impact fully. Blood glucose spikes, insulin surges, triglyceride production rises, fat storage increases, and unlike occasional dessert consumption, sugary drinks are often consumed habitually, daily, sometimes multiple times per day. This repeated exposure may place constant stress on metabolic and cardiovascular systems. Researchers studying population health repeatedly noticed a troubling pattern. Higher consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages was consistently associated with increased risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease. Not in every single individual. Human biology is always complex, but the overall trend became difficult to ignore. And perhaps most unsettling of all, many people consuming these drinks do not consider themselves unhealthy. A soda with lunch, sweet coffee in the morning, an energy drink during work, juice at night. The habit feels normal because the modern environment normalized it. But biologically, the cardiovascular system may be experiencing repeated metabolic shocks every single day. Now think about the hidden progression we have uncovered throughout this story. First, the brain learns to crave sugar. Then blood sugar instability begins. Then insulin resistance develops. Energy systems weaken, inflammation rises, and eventually the cardiovascular system itself becomes involved. This progression rarely happens overnight. It develops slowly, quietly, accumulating year after year, which is why so many people are shocked when disease finally appears. A person may feel relatively healthy until suddenly they are diagnosed with hypertension, or coronary artery disease, or prediabetes, or fatty liver disease. But the biological processes often began long before the diagnosis. Now let us confront one of the most frightening consequences: heart attack and stroke. Both conditions often involve vascular damage accumulated over decades, inflammation, plaque formation, clotting risk, vessel dysfunction. And while sugar is never the only factor, chronic metabolic dysfunction appears deeply connected to cardiovascular risk, especially when combined with sedentary lifestyle, chronic stress, poor sleep, smoking, and ultra-processed diets. The body becomes trapped inside a state of long-term biological overload, and the heart eventually pays the price. But here's something important. The cardiovascular system is remarkably resilient when given the chance to recover. Blood vessels can improve, inflammation can decrease, metabolic health can stabilize, insulin sensitivity can improve. The body is not fragile, it is adaptive. The problem is that modern lifestyles often bombard human biology continuously without allowing recovery. Constant stimulation, constant eating, constant sugar exposure, constant stress, an ancient cardiovascular system trapped inside an industrialized environment. And still, another organ has been silently carrying enormous burden through all of this, perhaps more than any other, because every sugary drink, every fructose surge, every metabolic overload eventually passes through one central organ responsible for processing much of it, the liver. And what scientists are now discovering about sugar's effects on the liver is deeply alarming, because millions of people may already have liver damage developing without drinking alcohol at all. A human liver can begin developing serious damage from something as ordinary as drinking soda every day. No alcohol, no obvious poisoning, no dramatic symptoms, just years of sweet beverages, processed food, and constant sugar overload slowly reshaping one of the most important organs in the human body. And the terrifying part is this: many people with early liver disease feel completely normal. No pain, no warning, no clear signal that anything is wrong. Meanwhile, deep inside the abdomen, fat may already be accumulating inside liver cells themselves. An organ designed to regulate energy, detoxify chemicals, balance metabolism, and stabilize blood sugar, slowly becoming overwhelmed by the modern food environment. So how does sugar damage the liver? Why are sweet drinks considered especially dangerous? And why are doctors around the world now seeing rising numbers of people with fatty liver disease who barely drink alcohol at all? To answer those questions, we need to focus on one particular type of sugar: fructose. Fructose occurs naturally in fruit and honey. In small amounts inside whole foods, the body generally handles it well because fiber slows absorption and intake remains moderate. But modern processed foods change the equation completely. Now, fructose often appears in concentrated forms inside sodas, desserts, syrups, sweetened beverages, candy, sauces, processed snacks, and ultra-processed foods consumed continuously throughout the day. And fructose behaves differently from glucose inside the body. Most cells throughout the body can use glucose directly for energy, but fructose is handled primarily by the liver. That detail matters enormously, because when large amounts of fructose enter the system repeatedly, the liver becomes responsible for processing much of the burden. Imagine the liver as a giant metabolic control center. Everything arriving from digestion passes through it: nutrients, toxins, hormones, energy signals. The liver constantly decides what should be stored, what should be burned, what should be released, what should be converted into fat. Under healthy conditions, this system is remarkably efficient, but modern sugar exposure may overwhelm it, especially in liquid form, because sugary beverages can deliver massive fructose load extremely quickly. A soda does not require much digestion. There is little fiber, little slowing mechanism. The sugar arrives rapidly, and the liver must process it immediately. When liver glycogen storage becomes saturated, excess fructose may increasingly be converted into fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. In simple terms, the liver starts turning excess sugar into fat. At first, the body attempts to store this fat safely, but over time, fat begins accumulating inside liver cells themselves. This condition is known as fatty liver disease, and in people who drink little or no alcohol, it is often called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Now pause for a moment and think about how strange this is. For generations, many people associated liver disease mainly with alcohol abuse. Yet millions of people today may develop fatty liver, primarily through metabolic dysfunction, driven by poor diet, obesity, insulin resistance, and excessive sugar consumption. And the numbers keep rising globally. Doctors are now seeing fatty liver disease not only in older adults, but increasingly in younger adults, teenagers, even children. An organ once damaged mainly by toxins is now being damaged by chronic metabolic overload. And because the process develops silently, many people do not discover it until years later during routine blood tests or imaging scans. Sometimes the diagnosis arrives accidentally. A person visits the doctor for unrelated reasons. An ultrasound reveals fatty infiltration. Liver enzymes appear elevated. The patient feels shocked. How can I have liver disease? I barely drink. But the biology has been building quietly for years. Now here is where the story becomes more dangerous. Fatty liver is not always harmless. In some people, the condition progresses, inflammation increases, liver cells become injured. Scar tissue begins forming. This can eventually lead to fibrosis, cirrhosis, and severe liver dysfunction. And all of it may begin with chronic metabolic stress. Now, another hidden question emerges. Why are sugary drinks considered especially harmful for the liver compared to many solid foods? Part of the answer involves speed. Liquids move rapidly through the digestive system. People can consume enormous amounts of sugar without feeling fully satisfied. A person might never eat the equivalent sugar load found in multiple sodas if it were presented in solid fruit form. The fiber and chewing process would naturally limit intake. But liquid sugar bypasses many natural protective mechanisms. The liver receives sudden concentrated fructose exposure repeatedly, day after day, year after year. And unlike occasional celebration foods, beverages often become habitual. Morning sweet coffee, afternoon soda, sports drinks, energy drinks, sweet tea, flavored beverages. The pattern becomes normalized. But metabolically, the liver may be under constant assault. Now remember the broader pattern we have been uncovering throughout this journey. The brain becomes conditioned to crave sugar. Blood sugar instability develops. Insulin rises repeatedly. Insulin resistance grows. Fat storage increases. Inflammation spreads. And now the liver itself begins accumulating fat internally. This is not a collection of separate problems. It is one interconnected metabolic story unfolding across the entire body. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the symptoms often remain vague. Many people with early fatty liver experience almost nothing obvious. Maybe fatigue, brain fog, mild abdominal discomfort, low energy after meals, difficulty losing weight. Symptoms so common they are often ignored completely. This is one reason metabolic disease can spread quietly through populations for decades before becoming visible as crisis. Now we arrive at one of the liver's most important roles of all: blood sugar regulation. The liver does far more than process nutrients. It acts as a major glucose storage and release center. When blood sugar drops between meals, the liver helps release stored glucose to stabilize energy supply. But when fatty infiltration and insulin resistance worsen, this regulation system may begin malfunctioning. The liver may continue releasing glucose even when blood sugar is already elevated. Insulin signaling becomes disrupted. Metabolic control weakens, and this pushes the body deeper into the cycle of insulin resistance and unstable energy regulation. The crisis feeds itself. More insulin resistance, more liver fat, worsening glucose control, increasing inflammation. Over time, the risk of type 2 diabetes rises dramatically. And once again, many people never see the process happening until symptoms become difficult to ignore. Now think about the hidden theme connecting everything we have explored so far. Modern sugar exposure does not simply create isolated cravings. It affects entire biological systems simultaneously: brain reward pathways, hormonal regulation, mitochondrial energy production, blood vessels, liver metabolism. An ancient human body forced to process industrial levels of concentrated sweetness continuously. And still, another mystery remains ahead. Because while many people fear sugar mainly for disease risk, millions are affected daily by something more visible: weight gain. But the relationship between sugar and body fat is far more complicated than most people realize, because not all calories behave equally inside the body. And some forms of sugar may interfere directly with the hormones controlling hunger, fullness, fat storage, and appetite itself, which raises a disturbing possibility. What if certain foods are not merely adding calories, but actively manipulating the biological systems that decide when humans stop eating? There are foods in the modern world specifically engineered to make your brain keep eating, even after your body already has enough energy. And once you understand how that works, the global obesity crisis begins looking very different. Because for years, many people were told a simple story: weight gain is only about willpower. Eat less, move more, control yourself. But millions of people discovered something confusing. They tried to eat less, yet felt constantly hungry. They lost weight temporarily, then gained it back. They counted calories obsessively, while cravings seemed to grow stronger instead of weaker. And meanwhile, ultra-processed foods became more addictive, more convenient, and more biologically stimulating than anything humans evolved to handle. So the real question became far more complicated. What if certain foods are not merely delivering calories, but actively disrupting the hormonal systems that regulate hunger, fullness, fat storage, and appetite itself? To understand that possibility, we need to return once again to insulin. Because insulin is not only involved in blood sugar control, it is also deeply connected to fat storage. Whenever glucose rises in the bloodstream, insulin helps move that energy into cells. But insulin also sends another important message to the body: store energy. From an evolutionary perspective, this was extremely useful. Ancient humans faced famine regularly. Periods of abundance needed to be stored for survival later. Fat storage was not a flaw, it was protection. The problem is that modern humans often live in permanent abundance, and when insulin remains elevated chronically because of constant sugar and refined carbohydrate exposure, the body may stay in storage mode far too often, especially when eating patterns involve repeated spikes throughout the day. Sweet breakfast, snack, sugary drink, dessert, late-night processed food. The body receives continuous signals that energy is abundant and should be stored. Now here's where things become deeply misunderstood. Many people think body fat is simply passive storage, but body fat is biologically active tissue, and not all fat behaves the same way. Subcutaneous fat sits beneath the skin. Visceral fat surrounds internal organs deep inside the abdomen, and visceral fat is far more dangerous metabolically. It releases inflammatory chemicals, worsens insulin resistance, disrupts hormonal balance, increases cardiovascular risk. This is why abdominal obesity is strongly associated with metabolic disease, even in individuals who may not appear extremely overweight externally. Now, remember the liver processes we explored earlier. Excess sugar, especially fructose, can be converted into fat by the liver. Some of that fat accumulates around organs, and over time, this internal fat becomes metabolically disruptive. The body enters a vicious cycle: more insulin resistance, more fat storage, more inflammation, more hunger, more metabolic dysfunction. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this entire story involves appetite itself. Because hunger is not simply about an empty stomach. Human appetite is controlled by an extraordinarily complex hormonal network involving the brain, gut, fat tissue, metabolism, and reward systems. And sugar may interfere with many parts of that network simultaneously. Under healthy conditions, the body uses hormones to regulate fullness and energy balance. One of the most important is leptin. Leptin is produced by fat cells and helps signal to the brain that sufficient energy is available. In simple terms, leptin helps tell the brain, "We have enough fuel. You can stop eating." But researchers believe chronic overnutrition and metabolic dysfunction may contribute to leptin resistance. In that state, the brain becomes less responsive to fullness signals. The body may already contain abundant stored energy, yet the brain continues acting as though more food is needed. This creates one of the strangest paradoxes in obesity. People may feel persistently hungry despite carrying large energy reserves. And highly processed sugary foods may worsen the problem because they stimulate reward systems intensely while often failing to create lasting satiety. Now think about how unnatural many modern foods truly are. A whole apple contains fiber, water, texture, chewing resistance, and moderate natural sweetness. A milkshake may contain enormous sugar load consumed in minutes with almost no physical effort. The brain receives intense reward stimulation, but fullness signaling may lag behind. This is especially true with liquid calories. Liquid sugar behaves differently from solid food in several important ways. It is consumed rapidly, absorbed rapidly, often fails to trigger strong satiety responses, which means people may consume large calorie loads without feeling proportionally full afterward. This is one reason sugary beverages are so strongly associated with weight gain in population studies. A person might never sit down and intentionally eat the equivalent sugar found in several sodas, but drinking it feels effortless, and the body still processes the metabolic consequences fully. Now here is where the modern food industry becomes extraordinarily powerful. Food engineers understand that the most profitable foods are often not the most satisfying foods. They are the foods that maximize repeat consumption. Crunch, sweetness, creaminess, salt balance, rapid melt-in-the-mouth texture. Entire products are scientifically designed to bypass natural stopping signals. Some researchers call these hyperpalatable foods. Foods engineered to overstimulate reward pathways while encouraging continued eating. And the brain responds exactly as ancient survival circuitry predicts. This is valuable. Consume more. Do not stop. But in nature, Such concentrated stimulation almost never existed. There were no industrial desserts in prehistoric forests, no giant sweet beverages, no chemically optimized snack foods. Human appetite systems evolved in completely different conditions. Now remember one of the hidden mysteries we have been tracing since the beginning. Why do some people feel hungrier the more sugar they consume? Part of the answer lies in instability. Rapid glucose spikes followed by crashes can trigger renewed hunger. But another part lies in reward adaptation and hormonal disruption. The body stops receiving clear satiety signals. The brain keeps seeking stimulation. Cravings intensify even when energy stores are already excessive. And eventually, eating becomes less connected to biological need and more connected to emotional reward, habit, stress relief, and neurological conditioning. This is why obesity is not merely a simple math equation. Calories matter, but biology matters too. Hormones matter. Reward systems matter. Food environment matters. Sleep matters. Stress matters. Modern humans are navigating ancient survival systems inside a world designed to maximize overconsumption. And still, another layer of the story remains hidden, because sugar's effects are not limited to weight, metabolism, or cardiovascular disease. The damage may even appear on the surface of the body itself, on the skin, around the eyes, in the texture of aging. Some scientists now believe chronic excess sugar may accelerate visible aging through processes happening deep inside tissues and collagen structures. In other words, the face staring back from the mirror may sometimes reveal metabolic stress long before laboratory tests do. And the mechanism behind that process is both fascinating and unsettling. Some signs of aging on the human face may begin with something far more ordinary than most people imagine. Not sunlight alone, not genetics alone, but the sweet drinks, desserts, and hidden sugars consumed every single day. Because deep inside the body, sugar may be interacting with skin, collagen, inflammation, hormones, and even sleep itself in ways scientists are still trying to fully understand. And the strange part is this. Many people spend enormous amounts of money trying to reverse visible aging from the outside, while the biological processes accelerating aging may still be happening internally every day. So how can sugar influence the appearance of the skin? Why do some people notice breakouts, dullness, puffiness, or premature wrinkles during periods of high sugar intake? And what hidden chemical process may slowly be affecting collagen itself over time? To answer that, we need to explore one of the most fascinating mechanisms in aging biology, a process called glycation. Glycation happens when excess sugar molecules attach themselves to proteins, fats, and other structures inside the body. Now, at first, this may sound harmless, but the consequences can become significant. Because many important tissues in the human body rely on proteins functioning properly, especially collagen. Collagen is one of the major structural proteins responsible for skin firmness, elasticity, and resilience. Young, healthy collagen behaves like flexible support wiring beneath the skin. It helps skin remain smooth, strong, and elastic. But glycation may gradually damage that structure. When sugar molecules bind to collagen fibers, they can form harmful compounds often called advanced glycation end products. These compounds may stiffen and weaken collagen over time. Instead of remaining flexible and resilient, collagen becomes more rigid and fragile, and the visible effects may slowly begin appearing on the surface. Fine lines, reduced elasticity, sagging, dullness, premature aging. Now, aging itself is natural. No food can stop time. But researchers increasingly believe chronic metabolic stress may accelerate certain visible aging processes, and sugar appears to play a role, especially when combined with inflammation, oxidative stress, poor sleep, smoking, ultraviolet exposure, and highly processed diets. But collagen damage is only one piece of the puzzle, because many people notice another very visible reaction connected to sugar: acne. Now, acne is complex. Hormones, genetics, bacteria, inflammation, stress, skincare, and lifestyle all interact together. But scientists have become increasingly interested in how high glycemic diets may influence breakouts in some individuals. Foods that rapidly spike blood sugar can increase insulin levels sharply. And insulin affects more than glucose. It also influences hormonal signaling related to oil production and skin activity. In some people, repeated insulin spikes may stimulate pathways that increase sebum production, the oily substance associated with acne development. At the same time, inflammation inside the body may rise. And inflammation is one of the central biological themes connecting many modern diseases together. The skin is not isolated from internal biology, it often reflects it. This is why periods of poor diet, stress, sleep disruption, and metabolic instability sometimes appear visibly on the face. The body is communicating internally through external signals. Now think about something fascinating. The skin is one of the fastest renewing organs in the human body. Cells are constantly repairing, replacing, and rebuilding themselves. That process requires stable energy, nutrients, hormonal balance, circulation, and controlled inflammation. But chronic high sugar exposure may disrupt many of those systems simultaneously. Inflammation rises, blood sugar fluctuates, hormonal signaling changes, oxidative stress increases. And over time, recovery systems may become less efficient. Now remember the hidden question running underneath this entire journey. Why does modern life seem to accelerate exhaustion and aging in so many people simultaneously? Part of the answer may involve chronic low-grade inflammation. Unlike acute inflammation from an injury, low-grade chronic inflammation can persist quietly throughout the body for years. Researchers now believe this type of inflammation may contribute to cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, cognitive decline, and accelerated aging. And diets high in ultra-processed sugary foods may worsen inflammatory burden in susceptible individuals. Not because sugar alone is evil. Biology is never that simple. But because constant metabolic overload may keep the body trapped in a state of continuous physiological stress. The body never fully stabilizes, never fully repairs, never fully recovers. And the skin often reveals that instability surprisingly quickly. Now another fascinating connection appears: sleep. Because sugar may influence sleep quality more than many people realize. At first glance, sweet foods seem relaxing. Desserts feel comforting. Sugary snacks create temporary pleasure. Late-night treats may seem calming emotionally. But metabolically, the story may be different. Rapid blood sugar swings during the night can disrupt stable sleep patterns in some individuals. A spike followed by a crash may activate stress responses. Heart rate variability may shift. Sleep fragmentation can increase. And poor sleep itself strongly affects skin health, appetite regulation, mood, inflammation, and aging processes. This creates another dangerous feedback loop. Poor sleep increases cravings for sugar. Sugar destabilizes metabolism. Metabolic instability worsens sleep quality. The cycle repeats. Now think about how deeply interconnected everything has become. The brain craves sugar for reward and stress relief. Blood sugar becomes unstable. Insulin resistance develops. Inflammation rises. Fat accumulates in organs. Energy systems weaken. And eventually the effects may become visible on the surface of the human body itself. Puffiness, dark circles, fatigue in the eyes, skin dullness, premature wrinkling, not because one dessert destroys the skin, but because years of metabolic stress slowly reshape biological systems from within. Now let us talk briefly about hair. Hair follicles are also highly sensitive to metabolic health, hormonal balance, circulation, nutrient availability, and inflammation. Periods of severe stress, rapid dietary instability, poor sleep, or metabolic dysfunction may contribute to hair shedding or reduced hair quality in some individuals. Again, the body prioritizes survival first. When internal systems are under stress, external maintenance becomes less important biologically. The body redirects resources toward essential survival functions. And this reveals one of the deepest truths in human physiology. Beauty and health are not completely separate systems. External appearance often reflects internal biological conditions more than people realize. Now another hidden question begins emerging. If sugar exposure can influence aging processes in adults, what happens when these metabolic patterns begin much earlier in life? What happens when developing brains and bodies are exposed to industrial levels of sweetness from childhood onward? Because children are not simply smaller adults. Their brains are still developing. Their reward systems are highly sensitive. Their habits are forming. Their metabolism is adapting to the environment surrounding them. And many scientists are becoming increasingly concerned that modern children may be growing up inside the most hyper-stimulating food environment in human history. A world where sweetness is no longer rare, but constant. Humanity may be witnessing the first generation in history raised almost entirely inside a world of ultra-processed food, a world where sweetness is available everywhere, all the time, in concentrations no child brain evolved to handle. Brightly colored drinks, sugary cereals, desserts marketed as breakfast, snacks engineered for maximum craving, sweet beverages inside schools, advertisements targeting children before they can even understand persuasion itself. And the most unsettling part is this: the developing brain of a child is not simply a smaller version of an adult brain. It is more sensitive, more adaptable, more impressionable, especially when it comes to reward systems. So what happens when developing brains are exposed to intense sugar stimulation from the earliest years of life? Could modern food environments be shaping childhood behavior, attention, appetite, and long-term health in ways we are only beginning to understand? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when an entire generation grows up believing extreme sweetness is normal? To answer those questions, we need to begin with dopamine again. Because childhood is one of the most neurologically dynamic periods of human life. The brain is still wiring itself. Connections are forming rapidly. Habits become deeply embedded. Reward systems are highly active. Children are naturally driven toward novelty, learning, and reward because evolution designed young brains to absorb information aggressively. But that same sensitivity may also make children especially vulnerable to hyperstimulating environments, including modern processed food. When a child consumes highly sweet foods repeatedly, reward pathways activate strongly. The brain learns rapidly. This is exciting. This is rewarding. Seek this again. And because children have less developed impulse control systems than adults, resisting those reward signals is naturally harder. This is not a moral failure. It is biology. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region involved in planning, self-control, and long-term decision-making, continues developing for many years. Meanwhile, reward circuitry is already highly active. Now combine that biology with industrial food engineering designed specifically to maximize craving. The result may be one of the most powerful behavioral environments children have ever faced in human history. Now another major question emerges. How does sugar affect attention and learning? For years, parents and teachers noticed something curious. Some children appeared hyperactive, unfocused, emotionally unstable, or mentally exhausted after consuming large amounts of sugary food and drinks. Scientific research in this area is complex and sometimes controversial. Human behavior is influenced by many variables: sleep, stress, home environment, genetics, screen exposure, nutrition, physical activity, and emotional health. But researchers increasingly believe unstable blood sugar and ultra-processed diets may influence attention, concentration, and cognitive performance in at least some children. Think about what happens metabolically after a high-sugar meal. Rapid glucose spike, rapid insulin response, temporary stimulation, then the crash. Adults experience this too. But in children, whose brains are developing and whose energy regulation systems are still maturing, the fluctuations may feel even more dramatic. Some children become restless. Others become irritable. Some lose focus quickly. Others feel mentally fatigued soon afterward. And because schools often demand long periods of concentration and emotional regulation, unstable energy patterns can become especially disruptive. Now consider something even more concerning. Many children today consume sweet beverages almost daily: soda, flavored milk, sports drinks, sweetened juices, energy drinks in older students. And liquid sugar is uniquely problematic because it delivers massive glucose load rapidly without creating strong fullness signals. A child can consume huge amounts of sugar in minutes. The brain receives intense reward stimulation. Blood sugar fluctuates rapidly, cravings strengthen, and the cycle begins repeating earlier and earlier in life. Now think carefully about the long-term implications. A child growing up with constant ultra-sweet exposure may gradually adapt to extreme levels of stimulation. Natural foods may begin tasting bland. Whole fruits may seem less exciting. Water may feel boring compared to flavored beverages. The brain recalibrates its expectations. This is one reason dietary habits established during childhood can become deeply persistent in adulthood. The brain learns not only what food tastes like, but what normal tastes like. And modern childhood environments are redefining normal at astonishing speed. Now we arrive at another major concern: childhood obesity. Researchers around the world have documented dramatic increases in obesity rates among children and adolescents over recent decades. And while many factors contribute, including reduced physical activity, screen time, sleep disruption, stress, socioeconomic factors, and food access, sugary ultra-processed diets are considered major contributors. Because children are not just consuming more calories, they are consuming foods specifically designed to encourage overconsumption, highly rewarding, rapidly absorbed, low in satiety, constantly available, and once excess weight begins accumulating early in life, metabolic consequences may follow much sooner than previous generations expected. Insulin resistance, fatty liver disease, elevated blood pressure, inflammation. Conditions once associated mainly with older adults are increasingly appearing in younger populations. And this alarms many scientists profoundly, because metabolic dysfunction beginning early in life may alter health trajectories for decades. Now let us talk about schools. In many modern environments, children are surrounded by sugary products almost constantly. Vending machines, cafeteria desserts, sports drinks marketed as healthy, celebration foods, sweet snacks used as rewards. Even educational environments sometimes reinforce the idea that sugar equals comfort, reward, and emotional positivity, and marketing plays a massive role. Children are especially vulnerable to advertising because their critical thinking systems are still developing. Bright colors, cartoon characters, emotional branding, excitement, fun. Food companies understand this extremely well. If brand loyalty forms early, consumption patterns may continue for years. Now remember one of the deeper hidden questions running underneath this entire documentary. What happens when ancient biological reward systems collide with modern industrial food systems? In children, the collision may be even more powerful because the brain itself is still developing. Habits become neurological architecture. Reward patterns become deeply encoded, and the effects may extend far beyond body weight alone. Researchers are increasingly investigating possible links between ultra-processed diets and emotional regulation, mood instability, anxiety, depression risk, sleep quality, and long-term cognitive health. The science is still evolving. Human behavior is enormously complicated, but one thing is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The modern food environment is unlike anything human biology evolved to experience, especially for children. Now here is the truly unsettling part. Most parents are not intentionally harming their children. They are navigating an environment designed to maximize convenience, stimulation, and consumption. An environment where sugar hides almost everywhere, sometimes even inside foods marketed as healthy. Breakfast bars, yogurts, granola, fruit drinks, sauces, bread, cereals, which leads us directly into another major problem hiding in plain sight. Because millions of adults believe they do not consume much sugar at all, while unknowingly eating enormous amounts every single day. Not through obvious desserts, but through hidden sugars buried throughout the modern food supply under dozens of different names. And once you start looking closely at food labels, the scale of the deception becomes difficult to ignore. Millions of people believe they consume very little sugar, they rarely eat cake, they avoid candy, they may not even drink soda regularly. And yet, without realizing it, many are still consuming enormous amounts of added sugar every single day. Not from obvious desserts, but from foods marketed as normal, healthy, convenient, or even good for you. Because modern sugar does not only live inside cookies and soft drinks anymore, it hides everywhere. Inside bread, pasta sauce, salad dressing, flavored yogurt, breakfast cereal, granola bars, protein snacks, instant oatmeal, plant-based milk, low-fat products, sports drinks, even foods advertised as healthy fitness options. And the truly unsettling part is this. Many consumers never realize how much sugar they are eating because the food industry learned something extremely powerful long ago. People are less likely to fear what they cannot clearly see. So how did sugar become hidden throughout the modern food supply? Why do so many processed foods contain added sweetness, even when they do not taste obviously sugary? And how can someone read a nutrition label without falling into the traps modern marketing creates? To answer those questions, we need to understand something important about processed food itself. Food companies are not simply selling nutrition. They are competing for attention, repeat purchases, emotional satisfaction, shelf stability, and craving. And sugar helps accomplish all of those goals simultaneously. Sugar improves flavor, masks bitterness, enhances texture, increases palatability, triggers reward pathways, encourages repeat consumption. From an industrial perspective, it is an extraordinarily useful ingredient, which is why added sugar spread far beyond desserts into everyday processed foods. Take bread, for example. Many commercial breads contain added sugar even when they do not taste sweet. Why? Because sugar improves browning, texture, softness, shelf life, and flavor appeal. Now multiply this across thousands of processed foods. Sauces become sweeter. Yogurts become sweeter. Snack foods become sweeter. Breakfast products become sweeter. And gradually, populations adapt to higher and higher sweetness levels until the taste begins feeling normal. This is one of the most important psychological shifts in modern nutrition. The human palate recalibrates. Foods that once tasted extremely sweet begin tasting ordinary. Meanwhile, natural whole foods may start seeming bland by comparison. Now here's where things become even more confusing. Sugar does not always appear on labels under the word sugar. Food manufacturers use dozens of different names: corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, maltose, dextrose, rice syrup, agave nectar, evaporated cane juice, fruit concentrate, barley malt, molasses, sucrose, glucose syrup. To the average consumer, these names may sound technical or harmless, but metabolically, many still function as added sugar sources contributing to total sugar load. And because ingredients are often split across multiple sweeteners, products may appear healthier than they really are. A cereal might contain several sugar sources individually lower on the ingredient list, while collectively delivering enormous sweetness. Now combine this with aggressive marketing. Words like natural, whole grain, organic, fitness, protein, low fat, heart healthy. Packaging colors associated with health. Images of fruit, athletic branding, claims about vitamins or probiotics. The product creates a health halo. Consumers assume the food is nutritious because the marketing feels nutritious. Meanwhile, the sugar content may remain extremely high. This becomes especially dangerous with foods marketed toward children. Bright colors, cartoon mascots, claims about calcium, vitamins, or energy. A sugary cereal suddenly appears healthy because nutrients were added artificially afterward, but metabolically, the body still experiences major glucose and insulin impact. Now let us talk about one of the greatest nutritional misunderstandings of the modern era: low-fat processed food. For decades, many consumers were taught to fear fat intensely. Food companies responded by removing fat from products. But there was a problem. Fat contributes heavily to flavor and satiety. When fat disappears, food often becomes less enjoyable. So manufacturers compensated with something else: sugar. Many low-fat yogurts, snack foods, dressings, and processed products became loaded with added sugars to restore flavor appeal. Consumers believed they were making healthy choices, while sometimes consuming even more sugar than before. And because sugar stimulates reward systems strongly, these foods often remained highly craveable. Now think carefully about how difficult this environment has become to navigate. An ordinary shopper walks into a grocery store filled with thousands of products. Many are engineered for overconsumption. Many use health-oriented branding. Many contain hidden sugars under unfamiliar names. And most consumers are busy, tired, stressed, distracted, and overwhelmed. The modern food environment does not merely require eating decisions, it requires constant detective work. Now another critical question appears: how can someone actually read nutrition labels effectively? One useful approach begins with simplicity. First, look at added sugars specifically whenever labels provide them. Not just total carbohydrates. Added sugars reveal how much sweetness was introduced beyond naturally occurring sugars. Second, examine ingredient lists carefully. Ingredients appear in descending order by quantity. If multiple sugar sources appear near the top, the product is likely heavily sweetened, even if no single sugar dominates the list. Third, pay attention to serving sizes. Many products contain deceptively small serving measurements. A beverage may appear moderate in sugar until the consumer realizes the bottle contains multiple servings. And perhaps most importantly, ask a simple question: would this food still seem healthy without its packaging? A fruit does not require marketing claims. Vegetables do not need cartoon branding. Eggs do not need health slogans. The more aggressively a processed food markets health identity, the more carefully consumers should examine it. Now, remember one of the hidden themes connecting this entire documentary. Human biology evolved in environments where sweetness was relatively rare. Modern industrial systems transform sweetness into a constant background condition. And because the transition happened gradually over generations, many people no longer recognize how abnormal the modern food environment truly is. Children grow up believing dessert-level sweetness is normal breakfast flavor. Adults consume sugary beverages daily without perceiving them as dangerous. Entire populations adapt metabolically to chronic overload. And meanwhile, rates of obesity, fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, and metabolic dysfunction continue rising globally. But here is the fascinating part. The human body often responds surprisingly quickly when sugar intake decreases. Not instantly, not magically, but sometimes within days, people begin noticing profound changes. Cravings shift, energy stabilizes, sleep improves, taste sensitivity changes, mental clarity returns. Which raises another important question. What actually happens inside the body when someone significantly reduces sugar for several weeks? Why do many people experience symptoms that resemble withdrawal? And why can the first days feel unexpectedly difficult, even when the long-term benefits become increasingly obvious afterward? Your body can react to cutting sugar almost like withdrawal, not because sugar is identical to addictive drugs, but because after years of repeated stimulation, the brain and metabolism may become deeply adapted to constant sweetness. And when that stimulation suddenly decreases, the body notices, sometimes dramatically. People often expect reducing sugar to feel immediately healthy and energizing, but many are shocked by what happens during the first few days. Cravings intensify, mood becomes unstable, energy drops, headaches appear, irritation rises. Some people feel strangely emotional, others feel mentally foggy or exhausted, and the most unsettling part is this. The reaction itself may reveal how dependent modern biology has become on rapid stimulation and unstable energy cycles. So what exactly happens inside the body during the first 7 to 30 days of reducing sugar? Why can the early phase feel unexpectedly difficult? And why do many people later describe feeling clearer, calmer, and more stable than they have in years? To answer those questions, we need to understand something important. The body loves familiarity. Even unhealthy patterns can begin feeling normal if repeated long enough. When someone consumes high amounts of sugar daily, the brain and metabolism adapt around those patterns. Blood sugar rises frequently. Insulin rises frequently. Dopamine spikes repeatedly. Cravings become predictable. Energy fluctuates constantly. The body begins expecting the cycle. Now imagine suddenly interrupting it. The brain immediately notices the missing stimulation. Reward pathways activate. Cravings intensify. The mind starts negotiating. Just one snack. One soda won't matter. I need sugar to focus. I deserve a treat. Many people discover during this stage that cravings are not only physical, they are emotional, habitual, social, and neurological at the same time. Sugar may have become attached to comfort, stress relief, celebration, boredom, fatigue, and emotional regulation. And when it disappears, the brain temporarily loses one of its familiar coping tools. Now here is where the experience becomes fascinating. During the first several days, some people feel worse before they feel better. This often surprises them. Fatigue may increase temporarily because the body is adjusting away from rapid glucose spikes and crashes. Mood may fluctuate. Mental fog may appear. Energy may feel unstable. Part of this reaction may involve dopamine adaptation. Remember, highly sweet processed foods stimulate reward pathways intensely. When stimulation decreases suddenly, ordinary experiences may initially feel less exciting. The brain is recalibrating. At the same time, blood sugar regulation systems are adjusting too. The body is learning to function with greater metabolic stability rather than constant spikes. And that transition can feel uncomfortable at first. Now think about how remarkable this is. Many people assume constant tiredness and cravings are simply part of normal life. But when they remove excessive sugar temporarily, they suddenly realize how unstable their previous baseline had become. Now, another major change begins occurring quietly. Taste perception starts shifting. This may be one of the most surprising effects of reducing sugar intake. After several weeks, foods that once tasted normal may suddenly taste overwhelmingly sweet. Fruit becomes more flavorful. Subtle flavors become noticeable again. Artificial sweetness may start tasting unnatural. Why? Because the brain and taste receptors are adapting downward after prolonged overstimulation. Remember, the nervous system constantly recalibrates based on repeated exposure. When sweetness becomes extreme and constant, natural flavors may feel muted. But once overstimulation decreases, sensitivity gradually returns. This is why many people eventually discover something unexpected. The foods they once craved intensely no longer feel as satisfying, and the foods that once seemed boring begin tasting rich and enjoyable again. Now let us talk about energy. This is where many individuals notice some of the most profound changes. At first, energy may dip temporarily during the adjustment period, but after several weeks, many people report something very different from the sharp stimulation sugar once provided. Stable energy, not euphoric spikes, not hyperactive stimulation, just steadier functioning, fewer crashes, less afternoon exhaustion, more consistent focus, reduced dependence on caffeine and snacks. Why? Because the body is no longer riding constant glucose roller coasters throughout the day. Blood sugar fluctuations may become less dramatic. Insulin spikes may decrease. Metabolic stability improves. And when energy systems become more stable, the brain often feels more stable too. Now remember another hidden question we have been tracing throughout this entire journey. What happens to mood and sleep when sugar intake decreases? Again, the first phase can feel emotionally uncomfortable. The brain misses rapid dopamine stimulation. Stress coping habits feel disrupted. Emotional cravings surface. But after adjustment, many people notice reduced irritability, calmer emotional patterns, and improved sleep quality. This may happen for several reasons. More stable blood sugar can reduce stress signaling fluctuations. Inflammation may decrease. Nighttime glucose instability may improve. Energy regulation becomes more balanced, and sleep itself begins restoring systems more effectively. Now think about the importance of sleep in everything we have discussed so far. Sleep influences appetite, cravings, hormones, insulin sensitivity, emotional regulation, memory, skin health, energy production. Poor sleep drives sugar cravings. Sugar instability worsens sleep. Breaking the cycle in one area may gradually improve the other, and slowly the body begins recovering. Now let us discuss visible physical changes. Some people notice reduced bloating surprisingly quickly after decreasing sugar intake. Why? Because high sugar and ultra-processed diets may contribute to inflammation, water retention, and unstable insulin patterns. As metabolic stability improves, fluid balance and inflammatory burden may shift. Skin appearance may improve too. Breakouts sometimes decrease, puffiness may lessen, complexion may appear clearer. Again, not because sugar alone controls all skin health, but because the skin reflects internal biological conditions remarkably well. Now, here is another fascinating observation many people report. Mental clarity, less brain fog, improved concentration, more stable motivation. Researchers are still exploring exactly how glucose regulation, inflammation, insulin sensitivity, and ultra-processed diets influence cognition. But many individuals describe feeling mentally lighter after reducing excessive sugar intake for several weeks. The mind feels less chaotic, attention stabilizes, mood swings soften, and perhaps most importantly, cravings often lose some of their power. Not completely, but enough for people to realize something extraordinary. The constant urge for sweetness was not entirely natural appetite. Much of it was conditioning. Repeated reward cycles training the brain to expect stimulation constantly. Now, another major change may occur during this period. Weight regulation often becomes easier, not because of magic, but because appetite signals may become clearer. Without constant glucose spikes and crashes, hunger may stabilize. Without liquid sugar, calorie intake may naturally decrease. Without hyperpalatable foods driving overeating, satiety signals may function more effectively. The body begins reconnecting with more natural energy regulation patterns. And yet, one critical truth must be understood carefully. Reducing sugar is not about achieving perfection. Human health is not built on fear, obsession, or punishment. The goal is not to panic over every dessert or eliminate all pleasure from eating. The deeper issue is chronic overload, an environment where ultra-processed sweetness became constant instead of occasional. And this leads directly into the final and perhaps most important question of all. Is sugar truly a modern poison, or is the real problem something larger? A world where human biology is now surrounded by levels of sweetness it never evolved to handle. Maybe the problem was never a single slice of cake. Maybe the real problem is that modern humans now live surrounded by levels of sweetness the human body never evolved to handle. Sweet drinks at breakfast, sugar hidden inside lunch, dessert-level sweetness inside snacks. Constant stimulation from ultra-processed food every hour of the day. An ancient metabolism, living inside a permanent flood of refined sugar. And after everything we have explored together, one final question remains. Is sugar truly a modern poison? Or has the conversation become too extreme? Because in recent years, public discussion around sugar has often swung between two extremes. One side treats sugar as harmless, the other treats it almost like pure toxic contamination. But human biology is rarely that simple, and understanding the truth requires nuance, because the goal is not fear, the goal is understanding. So do humans need to eliminate sugar completely? The answer for most people is probably no. The human body can process sugar. Glucose itself is deeply important for survival. The brain uses enormous amounts of it continuously. Natural carbohydrates have existed throughout human history. The real issue is not the existence of sweetness. It is the scale, concentration, and frequency of modern exposure. And perhaps nowhere is this confusion more obvious than in the debate between fruit and refined sugar. At first glance, they both contain sugar molecules. So why does the body often respond so differently? The answer lies in context. A whole fruit is not simply sugar. It is a biological package. Fiber slows digestion. Water increases fullness. Chewing slows intake. Micronutrients and plant compounds interact with metabolism in complex ways. Eating an apple is metabolically very different from drinking a large sweetened beverage containing concentrated refined sugar. One arrives gradually. The other arrives like a metabolic shock wave. This distinction matters enormously because modern processed foods often isolate sweetness from the natural systems that once regulated it. Fiber disappears, concentration increases, absorption accelerates. The body receives more sugar faster, more often, with fewer natural limitations. And this is where chronic overload begins. Now, another important question emerges. What actually counts as a reasonable amount of sugar? There is no single perfect number for every human being. Age, activity level, genetics, overall diet, sleep, stress, metabolic health, and medical conditions all matter. But many health organizations around the world recommend limiting added sugars significantly, especially liquid sugars from sweetened beverages. Notice the phrase added sugars, not naturally occurring sugars inside whole fruits and minimally processed foods. Added sugars, because these are often the sugars most strongly associated with overconsumption and metabolic instability. And perhaps the most important insight is this. Health is rarely destroyed by occasional enjoyment. The body is remarkably resilient. A dessert at a celebration is not the same thing as chronic daily overload. The danger usually emerges through patterns repeated continuously for years. This is one reason fear-based thinking around food often becomes counterproductive. People swing between restriction and overconsumption, guilt and craving, control and collapse. But sustainable health rarely comes from panic. It comes from consistency, small repeated choices, stable habits, an environment supporting long-term balance instead of constant extremes. Now think back to everything we uncovered throughout this journey. The brain evolved to crave sweetness for survival. Modern processed food hijacked those reward systems. Blood sugar spikes destabilized energy. Insulin resistance developed quietly, inflammation spread, fat accumulated around organs. The liver struggled. The cardiovascular system absorbed damage. Sleep worsened. Mood fluctuated. Attention weakened. Not because one ingredient alone destroyed the body, but because modern lifestyles created continuous metabolic overload. And this leads to one of the most important realizations in modern nutrition. Tiny changes repeated consistently may matter far more than dramatic short-term diets. Replacing sugary drinks with water more often, eating more whole foods, reducing ultra-processed snacks gradually, prioritizing sleep, stabilizing meal patterns, learning to recognize emotional cravings, creating environments with fewer constant temptations. These changes may sound small, but biologically they can become profound over years because the body responds to patterns. Now, here is something deeply hopeful. Human metabolism is remarkably adaptive. Blood sugar regulation can improve. Insulin sensitivity can improve. Inflammation can decrease. Energy stability can return. Taste perception can reset. Sleep can improve. Even after years of unhealthy patterns, the body often retains extraordinary capacity for recovery when conditions improve. Not perfectly, not instantly, but meaningfully. And perhaps this is the most important message of all. The goal is not perfection. Perfection is impossible. The modern food environment is too complex, too social, too emotional, and too deeply woven into everyday life. The real goal is awareness, to understand what the body is experiencing beneath the surface, to recognize that cravings are not always simple hunger, that energy crashes are not always normal, that constant exhaustion may have biological roots, that hyperpalatable foods are engineered to override ancient instincts. And once people understand that, they often stop blaming themselves so harshly. Because much of modern eating behavior is not occurring inside a natural environment. It is occurring inside one of the most biologically manipulative food systems humans have ever created. An environment where corporations compete aggressively for attention, craving, and repeat consumption. An environment where sweetness became industrialized. Now imagine an ancient human suddenly transported into a modern supermarket. Bright packaging everywhere, infinite desserts, sweet drinks larger than the human stomach, naturally evolved for, artificial flavors designed by laboratories, food available every hour of every day without physical effort. To that ancient brain, the environment would appear almost supernatural. And yet, modern humans are expected to navigate this landscape every day using biological systems that evolved for scarcity, not abundance. This does not mean sugar is evil. It means biology has limits. And perhaps the most dangerous thing about modern sugar exposure is not that it kills quickly, but that it reshapes health slowly enough for people to mistake the damage as normal life. The fatigue, the cravings, the brain fog, the poor sleep, the unstable energy, the metabolic dysfunction, all gradually normalized across entire populations, until feeling unhealthy started feeling ordinary. But ordinary is not always natural. And maybe that is the final truth hidden underneath this entire story. The greatest danger was never one cookie, one soda, or one dessert. It was the creation of a world where the human body is surrounded by more concentrated sweetness than at any other point in human history. A world where ancient survival instincts are being triggered continuously by foods the human brain was never truly designed to resist.